All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mohammed Khan. I'm the campaigns director at MPower Change. It's a grassroots movement. And we're here today to talk about Trump's Muslim ban, the impacts that it's having on our communities and our families, and finally, how we're going to beat it. So today is the one-year anniversary of when Trump's third Muslim ban, the one that's currently in effect, was supposed to first go into effect. That week, back in 2017, the executive order was actually blocked by a lower court. Unfortunately, that ruling only stood for about 2 months until early December of last year, when the Supreme Court allowed the ban to go into effect, ultimately ruling this past June in favor of the ban. So the Muslim ban has actually been in effect for about 10 months now. It's separating families and communities. It's been blocking people from entering the country for no reason other than Trump's hatred of Muslims and refugees. And today we're going to be talking about some of the stories of people impacted by the ban and our campaign to defeat and repeal the ban. So I'm really happy today to be joined by our panelists. We have Isra Shakar, who's the refugee campaign lead at Oxfam America. We have Mana Kharrazi, who's the executive director of Iranian Americans Across Borders, Iranian Alliances Across Borders, sorry about that. And Zahra Bilou, who's the executive director for CARE, San Francisco Bay Area chapter. So Zahra, why don't you kick it off for us? Tell us a little bit about the current state of the ban. What happened after the Supreme Court decision? Is there any hope of us overturning the ban through litigation, and what's going on with the ban right now?
Sure. Gosh, Mohammed, thank you so much for coordinating this conversation. It feels terrible and awkward to say, but we should just say it, right? The Muslim ban is fully in effect right now. If you are trying to come to the United States from Iran, Syria, Somalia, Libya, or Yemen, in the overwhelming majority of cases, you cannot come to the United States. For months leading up to the Supreme Court arguments and then the Supreme Court decision, we would tell people who would call our office, and they would call from near the embassy in Djibouti, from near the embassy in Malaysia, because there isn't even an open embassy in Yemen, or from other parts of the world. We would tell them just wait and see, right? Like it can't be that the Supreme Court will uphold the ban. And we said that for months. Just wait and see. Just wait and see. We'll do what we can. And then in June, the Supreme Court upheld the ban, and that was it. It was done, within a morning. There was a decision, and we had to go back to all of our clients and say, okay, clearly this is going to be a longer term problem than we had hoped it would be. And so in many cases, the only option for remedy is what's called a waiver. The presidential proclamation, which is in effect right now, that puts into position the Muslim ban, has certain exceptions. And if you meet those exceptions, they would say, then you should be able to come to the United States. Unfortunately, what we've seen with people applying for waivers is that there's no clear process. The communication from government staff is ambiguous and vague. People get different notifications depending on where they are. Overall, even of the people who on their face would appear to qualify for a waiver, less than 2% of them are actually getting them. And so to your question about what's possible with the litigation, the Supreme Court decided on Hawaii v. Trump. There were dozens of other lawsuits in place even when Hawaii v. Trump was decided, some of them challenging the entire ban, as the CARE National lawsuit did, some of them challenging various provisions of the ban, some of them that were class actions, so seeking to get remedy for a whole group, and others that were seeking remedy for just individuals. Many of those lawsuits are still in play. There's a number of lawsuits where plaintiffs' attorneys, so the attorneys representing people who are impacted, are seeking discovery. They're trying to get to the bottom of the paper trail, figure out what's going on. The most active lawsuits right now, though, are the ones that are on the waivers. So there's a number of groups that have filed lawsuits saying our client meets all of the criteria for a waiver. Like, the Muslim ban sucks, but hey, you said that there was a carve out. The Supreme Court justices talked about the carve out. Our clients should get in on the carve out, and they didn't. And so what do we do? And so those lawsuits are moving forward. And the hard thing is we want to win on those lawsuits, but I think we're at a place of we want to, as one of my colleagues will say, we want to cut the ban by 1,000,000 cuts, right? Like we want to demolish the ban through 1,000,000 little hits. And so the waiver litigation is important, both for the individuals that are suing, but also for the broader group of people who want waivers. They don't, however, on their own, take down the entire Muslim ban. They take down a portion of it, right? So they bring into question its legitimacy as the Supreme Court attempted, or as the Supreme Court seems to have perceived it. Like, this is okay, there was a security review in place, and there's an exception for people who really need it, except this exception doesn't really exist. I'd say that the hardest thing about being a lawyer through all of this, though, is being reminded of how many times our courts have gotten it wrong on issues involving Muslims and civil rights. And we saw that a lot post 9/11 with surveillance and Guantanamo, and just the reality that we don't get reprieve in the courts. But also historically, we've seen the court uphold slavery. We've seen the court permit the internment of Japanese Americans. And so part of why the conversation around repealing the ban is so important to me is because while we continue the litigation, and it is critical, and we are investing in it and want to make sure that the people who are impacted get the legal help that they need, we also need to be really honest with ourselves. The court upheld the Muslim ban. And so the court and the courts alone cannot be our single solution.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that. Yeah, I know that particularly when it comes to the waiver, that was one of the things that I think some of the justices actually mentioned as part of their rationale for upholding the ban. Do you think that, if it turns out that the waiver process can be proven to be a sham, as we've heard anecdotally and also through some of the statistics you mentioned, with only 2% of the people actually getting the waivers, do you think that can change the mind of folks who previously supported the ban because of this sort of, loophole with the waiver?
Yeah, I think that that's a great question. It takes a long time for a case to get to the Supreme Court. What we saw in the first year and a half of this administration is an expedited review of things like the Muslim ban. So I worry that the ban may not get taken apart at the Supreme Court level again. It may not get taken up there at all anytime soon, let alone taken apart. It's not to say that we don't try. And I definitely would agree with you that being able to show that the waivers are a farce and people aren't getting them despite the promise from the administration and the questioning by the Supreme Court justices can be an important way to change hearts and minds. Some of the people who are seeking waivers are in the most desperate of conditions. They've left war-torn countries. Their families have been separated. They've paid thousands of dollars in attorney's fees to try to just come to the United States. And so I'm hopeful that hearing these stories will actually be a major game changer for our fellow Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my next question is for Isra. We hear a lot of especially progressive politicians and kind of thought leaders talking about, priorities of how to undo some of the harms caused by the Trump agenda. We hear about things like abolishing ICE, like clawing back the tax cuts for billionaires and the wealthy. One thing we don't really hear, even from folks that we consider allies, is efforts to repeal the ban. And, we don't really hear about repealing the ban as a progressive priority. Why do you think that repealing the ban is not sort of included in the checklist of progressive priorities alongside things like abolishing ICE and Medicare for all and free college education, et cetera?
This is a really great question, Mohammed. Salam alaikum and hello to everyone joining us today. I think it's really important to realize that I think there's still a lot of stigma around the Muslim ban and around understanding who it actually directly impacts. We don't realize that there's a lot of Americans that were born and raised here that are directly impacted by the Muslim ban. We don't realize that it doesn't just affect Muslims, but it affects refugees from certain countries. It affects vulnerable people fleeing violence, persecution, war, and unimaginable circumstances in search of safe haven here in America. And I think we haven't been really able to draw the parallel, especially with our progressive allies, that this is just setting the precedent for continued discriminatory policies that may not target Muslims tomorrow, but will target another vulnerable population. So it's unfortunate that sometimes I feel like because the word Muslim is involved in this ban, that there's a lot of stigma around that, and people don't feel like they have to tiptoe around how to handle it. But what should only matter is that this directly discriminates against people based on religion. And we call a spade a spade, and it's really important to be able for us to recognize that and hold people accountable, no matter who they are, including our allies. I think that some progressive allies that I've spoken to feel that it's not necessarily their value add or an issue that they should take on and lead on. And I think that into that is that you're right. You shouldn't necessarily be leading in this work. There are incredible people who are directly impacted in incredible organizations, most of which are on the call right now, that are leading in this work, but that doesn't mean that silence is the answer. So it's really important for our allies and for those who want to get involved, whether it's an individual level or an organization level, to recognize that even if you can't relate to this ban in any way, shape, or form personally or professionally, that you can, in the sense of, imagine somebody challenging your civil liberties and your right to freedom of religion and freedom of expressing that religion and your country of origin, and imagine what that would feel like, and recognizing that that's something that is universal, that's something that we all can connect on, and we all have to together fight against that and hold people accountable. So I think that also it's a lack of stories and visibility consistently in the news cycle and in the media, and that's really it's kind of what would I say? It's interesting because it's like we knew when it first came out, it was so powerful, and we had stories every day, and we were in the airports, and we were protesting, and we were rallying. And then as the news cycle flips onto something else, we think that the impact on this has gone away, or that it's not necessarily as important, or it shouldn't be a priority as it was when it first started. But like Zahra just mentioned, it's even more of a priority now. The fact of the matter is that we can't continue to allow this to be unchallenged. Yes, we face the reality of this is where we are at, and it exists, and it is legal, and it is being implemented, and it has had a tremendous impact on not just Muslims and Muslim Americans, but also on refugees and immigrants overall. But we cannot continue to allow it to be unchallenged and not continue to call it out for what it is. So I think we need to increase visibility. We need to remind people of the human impact. We need to remind people of how it directly impacts them, and just remind each other that our American values call on us to see this as an immoral obligation for us to actively work on together.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And yeah, I think, it is super important for folks to be hearing stories of people impacted by the ban. So for all of you who are working, in the communities and with people impacted by the ban, I'm sure you're hearing stories, every day of families and communities that are being torn apart and kept apart by this ban. So yeah, I think, this next question is for everyone, maybe starting with Mana, if you could just share like a couple stories, either, of your own impact from the ban or people that you know and work with, and how the ban is impacting them, has been for almost a year now.
Yeah, definitely. I think for the members of our organization, it's everything from, having a parent come to their wedding to having their actual partner even be able to come. We have a couple folks that are engaged that are working on trying to get a waiver for their significant other to be able to come back here. There's issues with parents and some of the parents in our community not being able to come back that normally would get visas to be able to come and stay with their kids and see their grandchildren. And then there's the young people that I work with, whether they're missing a relative or they're just growing up in this climate of demonization and the hatred that they're experiencing every day.
I guess I'll go next. So I am personally impacted by the Muslim ban, and I am from originally Syria, but I was born and raised in the U.S., lived here my entire life, but my entire extended family is still in Syria. And I haven't been able to see them since the Syria crisis began in 2011. And because of the Muslim ban, I'm not able to apply for them or see them or be reunited with them here in my home, the US. And I think that I had no idea the impact that policies coming from this administration could have on me, being an American, born and raised here, speaking the language and understanding the cultural nuances. And honestly, being so privileged in the ability that I do the work that I do every day, and the ability to pursue an education, et cetera. And so when the Muslim ban came out and Syria was on the list, I couldn't believe it. And I still didn't understand fully the impact it would have on me. And then I started to realize that those that were applying for refugee status were not going through. Those that were in the refugee process that were about to be resettled, which I'll get to in a second, were stopped and put in limbo. Those that were applying for sort of visas to sort of be reunited with their family or have them come to an occasion, or someone who is ill who needs to seek treatment on the US, all of that was brought to a halt. And just the idea of the fact that I physically cannot reunite with my family here in my home, is incredibly difficult to comprehend, especially when I don't understand the rationale behind it. So it's extremely frustrating. And I never thought I'd be in a position like this today, but I think it's really important to recognize there's a lot of people like me who have family members in the countries that are directly impacted by the ban that are on the list. And they're feeling the exact same frustration I'm feeling. And one thing that I'm able to do is, in leading the refugee work for Oxfam, the refugee campaign, I'm able to then try to figure out and find those stories and amplify those stories that are impacted. And I was actually just at Zaatari refugee camp last week. And in my time in Zaatari, I met a refugee whose name is Khalid. And he is a refugee who has polio, has a few young children, and was in the process of being resettled here in the United States. And he had finished the entire vetting process. As we know, it's the most extensive vetting process known in the world today. And he had gone through all the security checks, even past the last step of the physical examination that they do. And as was just about to buy the plane tickets, he had about, I think they said, a week until he got on a plane. And then the Muslim ban came out, and it completely stopped him from being resettled. And this was almost 2 years ago. And Khalid is still at Zaatari refugee camp, doing the best that he can to provide for his family. And so talking to him, he told me what happened. Why did this happen? I was this close to seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And I'm quoting him. And he said, I'm shocked that I was this close and I did everything the United States asked of me to do. And I did not put myself in this position. I didn't ask to be a refugee. I didn't ask to have the circumstances that I'm dealt with. And yet, one person could take that away from me, could take that future away from my children, could take that future away from all of us in seeking that safety and a better life out in the US. And so it kind of brought it all back to me full circle that, again, we don't realize the impact of this ban, but it is so real. And this ban has changed lives of thousands, tens of thousands of people who were seeking safety and a dignified life and that light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that and for the work that you're doing. I think you made a really good point that it's, just based on one person's animus and hatred towards Muslims and immigrants and refugees that has led to this policy, and somehow, the rest of our institutions, including the Supreme Court itself, which is supposed to be sort of a neutral arbiter of justice, although we've seen that, myths unravel over the past few weeks with the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh, who's really just a radical right-wing judicial operative to the court. We've seen that the institutions around Trump sort of normalizing him and supporting him, even though it's very clear to anyone that it's just his personal animus and personal bias that has led to this policy. So maybe you could share a couple of stories, or what you've been feeling as far as the impact of this ban over the past year.
Sure. One of the stories that breaks my heart the most is something that goes along with what Mana was talking about, with people wanting to be with their loved ones. We had a client at one point who was in a relationship, and the only way for her to be with her partner was to move outside of the United States. And I remember when I first heard the story, I was like, oh, like this is like such a sweet love story, like people who are united across continents and love each other despite cultural differences. And then the Muslim ban was upheld. And for this woman, what that meant was to leave the United States. We've also heard from a lot of Yemeni families whose country is being torn apart right now by a Saudi-led war crimes, right? Like Saudi Arabia, we are selling arms. America is selling weapons to Saudi Arabia, which are then being used to bomb school buses and weddings and villages. And so Yemen is on the brink of what I think I read might be the worst famine in 100 years. And those people can't come to the United States. The embassy in Saudi Arabia Yemen has been closed for a number of years. And so if you're Yemeni and you're trying to come to the United States, you have to go via Djibouti or Malaysia or Egypt in some cases. And so we've heard from a lot of families who are stuck in these, essentially what are transit cities for them. They didn't think that they would be there long, and they get stuck there, unable to go back to Yemen because of the conditions on the ground there, but also unable to come to the United States because of the Muslim ban. I met a man a couple of months ago at a masjid whose story is one of those ones that haunts me. He came up to me and he had his teenage son with him. It was a youngish teenage son. And he said, my family's not here because of the Muslim ban. And I looked at him confused because he clearly had his son with him. And he said, yeah, but my wife is with the other kids in Djibouti. And so what had happened was that he had multiple kids, and only one of them got the permission to come to the United States. And so both him and his wife inadvertently became single parents, separated by oceans, which is an impossible, it's hard enough to be a single parent, in general, but to have the rest of your family, to have your kids separated by the Muslim ban, I don't even know what to tell you, except, hey, we'll apply for the waiver and we'll see what happens. And so we've heard dozens of stories like that. And that's just at our care office alone. We have a large Yemeni community, a large Somali community near where our office is. But I know that care offices across the country have been receiving complaints like this for some time now. I think before I pass it back to you, though, there's something that you said that I want to push back on just a little, right? And it's to say that it's one man's animus that led us down this path. For sure, he's who catalyzed our president, or this president, fascist in chief, is who catalyzes the hate that leads to the Muslim ban. But the conversation I've been having with members of my Muslim community have been that the system's not broken. It's working exactly the way it's supposed to, right? And so this is not our first time excluding people based on race, religion, or national origin. We've done far worse to people over time, of course, including the genocide of indigenous people, the slavery of Black people, the prison industrial complex, all of these things. And so it's not one man. It's not one man's animus. He's representative of a larger system, but also of institutional racism that is far deeper and doesn't end, by the way, if he loses his election or his re-election in 2020. And the reason that that's important for me to name and for us to be thinking about is because it's not just about who's here. I think maybe if I were to think of it's not just about who's impacted by the ban. If I were to think about a silver lining around this, it's that we're now having conversations about the generations of genocide, exclusion, kidnapping, and terror that the American government has engaged in immigrant parts of the Muslim community, where in many cases those conversations didn't exist before.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you for correcting me on that. I totally agree. It's not just one.
I get that you probably believe all of those things. It was more for the
Right. But yeah, I mean, I think you brought up another good point, is that, the Muslim ban is just one part of a much broader agenda of white nationalism, of racism and xenophobia that has become, very normalized under this administration. Lana, maybe you could talk a little bit more about how, the ban fits in with this broader domestic and foreign policy agenda of this administration.
Yeah, I think for our communities, this isn't the first way we've been attacked, right? So we've been dealing with this particularly since 9/11. And I think a lot of what came out of that in terms of infrastructure is what we're seeing at the border and how it's affecting families and how it's separating humans, right? And I think to Zahra's point, it feeds into this larger need to keep us out, to kind of scapegoat us. I think particularly in this climate, there is a need for scapegoats. And I think focusing on our communities and separating us in this way and banning families and the dehumanization that's occurring both against Latinx communities and against Masa communities is this larger policy that's really working and being able to keep us out and to keep people distracted from us and, you know, painting it as some sort of campaign about how they're protecting and securing these communities. But in reality, as an Iranian American, like I'm feeling it on a lot of different levels, right? So like this is the week where one of our members of Congress, a senator who may play an even more crucial role in the next year, said that having heritage like mine is terrible, at the same time as, you know, my family and a lot of Iranians overseas in Iran having to deal with like a failing currency and all sorts of issues of like potential conflict. And that's just one of these diaspora communities that, you know, there's what's going on in Yemen. So I think ultimately it's a way to play into this larger agenda of making us hate it here and being able to play into some warmongering agenda as well.
Yeah, and I think that's why it's so important, you know, for Mosque communities and communities impacted by the ban to work and build solidarity and, you know, build in movements with communities impacted by other, you know, policies of this administration, because, you know, this administration's agenda is really to exclude Black and brown people and non-Christian people from this country, whether it's excluding us altogether or, you know, finding ways to exclude us from public and civic life through different policies. Or did you want to add something?
No, I thought Mena did a
Okay.
good job. I'm just like nodding and agree with everything you're saying.
Got it. Thank you. So back to Zara. So, you know, we have the ban in place. Seems like there's some potential for things to happen on the litigation on the court side, but really that's not, you know, obviously the main focus of the campaign at this moment. So what are some of the legislative or other pathways that we have for repealing the ban?
Yeah, I mean, so the courts are hard, right? Like we lost and we're going to keep pushing there. At the same time, a big part of this for us is, hey, let's make sure that the protests continue. Let's make sure that people's storytelling continues. So if any one of you who are tuning in know someone who's impacted by the ban, who has a particularly compelling story that they're comfortable sharing, please reach out to any of us that are speaking so that we can tell that story. I think a lot of times people think of the Muslim ban. I meet some people who don't realize the Muslim ban is in effect right now, which is the most frustrating thing to hear someone say. But even for those who do, they think of it as far away and small and minor. I've heard this even in the Muslim community, where Muslim leaders will say, oh, the Muslim ban's not that big of a deal. Not that many people are impacted. And it's like, actually, thousands of people are impacted, and the impact is incredibly severe. And so we want to tell those stories. But really the next major focus for us will be on legislative attempts to repeal the ban. And that's actually the hashtag we've been using for that conversation, repeal the ban. We are urging organizations and community members and people of conscience and allies to support two pieces of legislation. It's House Bill HR 4271 and or Senate Bill 1979. The bills are nearly identical. They're on different sides of Congress. One's on the House side, the other is on the Senate side. And keep in mind that there's a lot of legislative attempts to repeal the ban. So there's different ways that people are trying to cut at the ban with the assistance of their members of Congress, including, by the way, one of the most important ways on the effort to fight for waivers, is all of the data inquiries that we're asking members of Congress to submit. And that's actually how we've learned a lot about how the ban is being implemented, how many waivers are being given out, is through data inquiries. These two pieces of legislation, though, are different because they're a lot more comprehensive. So we're doing a lot of like cut it by a million cuts, but HR 4271 and S 1979 both specifically would prohibit any use of federal agency resources to implement the presidential proclamation that is the Muslim ban. So, you know, when we were kids in school, we would learn that there were three co-equal branches of government, and their responsibility was to play as checks and balances on each other. The circumstance that we're in right now is one where the executive branch is vehemently racist. It's not only led by a racist, it's staffed by his racist friends. We then have a judicial branch that has essentially looked the other way. The Supreme Court upheld the Muslim ban. They said that the president was within his authority to do those things. And so now we're turning naturally to the third branch of government and asking them to play a check role on the other two branches. And so these two bills are what we're supporting. We would urge you to sign the petition, get your organization to blast it out, send it out to people. The more that we can move our members of Congress, the better. And it's hard because, you know, will Congress really do anything in this moment? We don't know what Congress will look like after November. We know that there are a lot of good people in Congress right now, and there's a move to put even better people in Congress. And so what we want to do is give them one of their first work assignments, whoever is in power, come November, and say, your task, right? The demand that tens of thousands of Americans are putting on you, our elected officials, is to repeal the ban, to bring the executive branch and the judicial branch to rein them in and say, we are better than this, or we want to be better than this.
Yeah, and then, you know, while the ban is in place, Isra, maybe you could tell us a bit about how people, you know, what are the resources that are available for people to know their rights when it comes to dealing with the ban?
Yeah, especially with this ban, everyone in particular, with all the legal maneuvering and the window dressing we've seen with it. And I think that that's contributed to a lot of people not knowing that we have a Muslim ban in effect, because there's been so many different iterations. And I think it's a little convoluted about the legal process that literally Zahra just mapped out so eloquently. So I'm super impressed, Zahra. But that's what you do. So I think it's really important to know that there are many resources out there for you, and there are many more that are coming up every single day. Beyond those that are on the call right now, especially CARE, who has the legal aspect down, ACLU, who are contributing on the front lines with all these other Muslim organizations and continue to fight it legislatively and in the courts if there is a potential in that space. MENA's organization, IAAB, MPower Change, they're all organizations that are consistently putting out content and to understand your rights, and also resources where you can contact someone to get more information. I also want to say that the National Iranian American Council, NIAC in particular, has a really, really great resource on their website breaking down Muslim Ban 3.0 and what you should know. But it's really important to not just take what you see on TV or in the media or even on Facebook at face value, to know that you have rights, and that you need someone that understands legally, professionally, what those are to consult with. So beyond getting the information from these organizations, if there are specific questions that you may have about your status or your families, or any sort of questions about your impact of the ban on you, then I would reach out to any legal counsel in particular. And again, CARE offers that, the ADC offers that. There's a lot of organizations who are offering that sort of support. And it's really important to be informed and be educated and stay on top of this. And like Zahra said, you know, we should continue to be at rallies. We should continue to be at protests. We should continue to dissent around this, because we need to make sure that we keep the pressure up, or that people are still aware in our communities that this is still a problem that we have to face and deal with.
Can I add something really quick, Isra and Mohammed?
Yeah, please.
So one of the hardest things we've heard from people who are impacted is, well, I talked to a lawyer and the lawyer wants $5,000 and I don't have $5,000. So the thing about all of the places that you mentioned, Isra, is that the legal services are free. And it doesn't matter if you're paying $5, $10, $15, or $20,000 for getting free services. The 2% success rate of waivers is 2% across the board. And so we've been telling people, please don't pay that kind of money. It's actually really problematic that attorneys are trying to rip you off when they know that they don't have a higher chance of success than anyone else.
Yeah.
And don't not apply or not dissent or not try to get help because you think you can't afford it. Like, all of us are providing we're fundraising in the community, we're fundraising in philanthropy. We are raising the money to make sure that your ability to pay for an attorney is not what determines your ability to be with your family.
Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. Thank you for flagging that, Zahra. Free, keyword, important, accessible.
Yes.
Great. And one other question off the point that you raised, Zahra, you know, historically, our communities and communities of color haven't really been able to rely on institutions in the U.S. to provide justice for us from, any of the three branches really, whether it's the courts or the legislature or the executive branch. So Mana, this question is for you. What can we be doing like internally within our communities, to kind of protect each other and help each other, while the ban's in effect, outside of the work that we're doing, to advocate for and lobby these institutions?
Yeah, I think as an Iranian American, my advice would probably be first to have the difficult conversations internally, because I think there are a lot of members of our community that are feeding into an agenda that potentially are working against us, right? And I think whether it's people who are not directly affected or are focusing more on foreign policy and have like a specific view, particularly I know that's true within the Iranian diaspora, that's something we grapple with, but I think within all Muslim communities, there are members of our communities that we need to either, like get on board or make irrelevant, I think, at this point. And then I think that also working with other communities. So like I'm trying to be a really good ally and working with other communities that are impacted by this ban. And I think that we all have to come together because we are young diaspora communities. So a lot of our communities don't have a lot of infrastructure and are just like getting into, like civic engagement and like how to be actually able to like work together on fighting this on the Hill. And then I think longer term, it's like we have to be able to be good partners and allies for others because we won't be able to win this on our own. And, this is one form that we're facing, and there's another form that Latinx communities are facing, but in the end, they're all coming back to the same xenophobia and hatred of us and othering. And it's our wave of communities that are going through this that can learn from previous communities historically what they've done and then be able to combat that now together. But I think ultimately, first and foremost, is like, let's have those conversations, about how like pulling the ladder up after our wave is wrong, about how, like if you have ideas about regime change, like it shouldn't be at the expense of people here and the families that are being affected by this. And that ultimately, like our young people look at themselves as, not as like separate as Pakistani or as Arab or as Iranian, but they see that we all have the same experiences right now and we're facing the same struggles. And there's a lot of solidarity in that. So I think some generational conversations and maybe even, like multi-generational or internal generational organizing needs to happen too.
Awesome. So I think we're going to open it up for Q&A from folks watching the Facebook Live right now. So if you're tuning in, just comment some questions and then we'll get our panelists to answer them. We have one question for Zafra, free legal advice since you offered it. Are you seeing any spouse waivers come through, and what is the current processing time?
So we have seen some people who are coming through, but it's less about what your relationship is to the person, like whether you're a spouse, a daughter, or a son, as it is about the conditions, like what kinds of hardships would be in place. And the processing time really varies, right? Just because less than 2% are being granted, there isn't even a significant enough pool for us to be like, oh, the average processing time is X. Most attorneys I know have at best had a few waivers granted. And so I would say that for the person who's asking, best to call your local care office or any other sort of legal nonprofit that we work with and get an assessment of your individual circumstances.
Okay, great. So thank you, Jeff Haskell, for asking that question. I don't know if we have any other questions right now, but I actually have one question for the panel. This was a pretty heavy topic, and we know that the impacts in our communities are very severe and, heartbreaking, and we hear these stories and deal with these circumstances every day. But, we're all here committing to fighting this ban and to fighting other unjust policies. So what is the thing, one thing that's giving you hope in this moment, that's keeping you grounded and keeping you committed to continuing this fight for justice for our community? whoever wants to go first.
I can, I think, because I'm grateful for the sector I work in. I work with young people, and honestly, like anytime you feel down, just go interact with some young people because they get it. They get a lot of the issues that we're dealing with. They're if it were up to them, this wouldn't be our current situation. But they're understand the politics and they understand how to work together. And yeah, get yourself next to some youth.
Mm-hmm. I think for me, it's definitely seeing how incredibly well the Muslim and other vulnerable communities have mobilized in this moment. I've seen some of my own people in my own circle who have never said anything remotely political or engaging in civil society issues on Facebook or even in person now be super engaged in this issue and wanting to understand more about how our government operates, different policies that are affecting different communities. So I've seen a shift in even the culture around, like what Mena says, youth and our conversations. People want to talk about these issues. People want to organize around these issues. A lot of my friends and I go protest together. It was never a thing to do that before, but now it's become where it's like, this is what is the standard, like to be someone who is a good person who contributes to making this world a better place is really important. I do want to share that on my way back from Jordan after this really emotional trip and eye-opening experience, hearing these stories and feeling hopeless because I know that the U.S. Resettlement in particular is just so dismal right now. I was at the airport and on my flight, there was a family being resettled to Canada. And I saw them and I saw the UN and the IOM outfits and I went up to them and I just introduced myself and it brought tears to my eyes seeing these kids that were so excited for this next chapter in their life. And I just said, okay, I was meant to see this as I was leaving because it's meant to hopefully signify a day when we'll be welcoming people back the way that we should be, that we should be. So it was really powerful and really uplifting way to end my trip.
I feel like twice now in our conversation today, I've had to follow you, Isra, and I'm just like, oh, I don't know what's left to say. No. Thank you for sharing that. I can't even begin to imagine how meaningful it must have been, especially after everything that you've seen in the last year and how you're personally impacted by the ban.
Yeah.
I guess my thought, Mohammed, on what gives me hope is the election. Like, it sounds absurd, and for me, it's not about Democrats or Republicans, at least not when I'm wearing my 501c3 hat at CARE. It's even, I'm in California. We've got Democrats running against each other here. And what gives me hope in this moment is the amount of engagement that we're seeing in the community and among fellow Americans. I think like vote.org this is absurd, but with Taylor Swift, coming out with her political statement, and then others pushing people to vote.org, I thought that I'd read that they registered probably close to 1 million voters thus far this year, and their goal was just 500,000. And so I'm excited about that. I'm excited about our elected officials feeling the heat and not taking their seats for granted, which is why I mentioned Democrats running against each other's. Even Democrats in office are being pushed and should be pushed to do more, to do better, to be courageous. One of the things that I was really frustrated about during the Kavanaugh hearings and then his confirmation was, hey, what more could the Democrats have done when our sisters from the Women's March, including our very own Linda, were being arrested nearly daily, putting their bodies on the line? What more could, including yourself, by the way, Isra, I saw you at the protest, right? When they were putting their bodies on the line, what more could our elected officials have done? And so what gives me hope is knowing that come November, there is an opportunity to replace people on any side of the aisle, on any party, and at so many levels. And by the way, that includes all of the incredible Muslims who are running for office, right? But to put people in office who will do more, who will do better, and who will help us move closer to the values that we aspire to.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Thank you all for sharing that. We did have one more audience question from Delhi Combo. Assalamu alaikum, Delhi. She asks, what is the best way to get our congressional reps after November to support the two bills that are introduced? So I can take that one, actually. So the best thing you can do right now is to go to repealthemuslimban.com. There's a petition there to Congress asking them to support the two bills to repeal the ban. Sign on to that petition. We'll be delivering it after the elections, and then starting in January, once the new Congress comes in, we'll be, going through a bunch of other actions, visiting folks in DC, visiting folks in the district, calling Congress, and really you'll see, I think, inshallah, a pretty robust campaign come next year to lobby Congress to take up this legislation and to pass it. And then if there's no other questions at the moment, I'll just add an answer to my own question about what's keeping me hopeful. I think what's keeping me hopeful is really the way people are starting to think much more boldly about the future. And I look to things like the prison abolition movement and the push to abolish ICE is really inspiring me and give me hope that even in this moment when we're facing, such a dark cloud of fascism and authoritarianism in this country, people still find it, in themselves to be able to imagine a future without police, without prisons, without ICE. I think that gives me hope in, the work that we do every day to imagine a future where our communities are, also liberated from the injustice and oppression that we're facing under the system and this administration particularly. Okay, so I don't think there's any other questions. So we'll call it a day. Thank you all for joining us so much, and thanks everyone for tuning in. Again, visit repealthemuslimban.com, sign up to the petition, follow organizations on this call, Oxfam, CARE, IAAB, MPower Change, and inshallah we'll keep moving forward and repeal the ban. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.